Hi, my name is Becky Belding, and I'm a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. We are here at the Seward Community Library and Museum in Seward, Alaska, where we have the Americans and the Holocaust exhibition, which is sponsored by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the American Library Association. Seward is one of 50 libraries across the United States, which will be displaying this exhibition over the next 2 years, and we're really proud to have the exhibition here in Alaska. The Holocaust was the state-sponsored systematic persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews by Nazi Germany and its allies and collaborators between 1933 and 1945. And this exhibition looks at a couple of different things. It looks at what did Americans know about the Holocaust as it was happening. This we try to answer over the course of the exhibition. And then we want you to think about what more could Americans have done about the Holocaust as it was happening. In the introduction to the exhibition, we really look at what America looked like in the 1920s and 1930s. And what you see in this introductory video here is that Americans had a lot of fears and challenges of their own. In 1929, the Great Depression began. And so by 1933, when Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, 25% of the American workforce is unemployed. This is Jim Crow America, and many American communities are racially segregated, either by law or by custom. There's a lot of fear of immigrants and of new arrivals, particularly if people are Jewish or Catholic or considered somehow otherwise undesirable as immigrants. And so when the United States starts to learn about what is happening in Nazi Germany, Americans have a lot of fears and concerns and pressures of their own. This section asks, what did Americans know about the Holocaust as it was happening? What did they know about the Nazis? And what you see here are different magazine covers. These are all covers from the early years of Nazi control in Germany. This is from 1932, even before Hitler takes power in Germany. This is from 1933. This is the Nazi propaganda minister, Paul Joseph Goebbels. And the tagline on this magazine cover, this cover of Time magazine, says, "Say it in your dreams, the Jews are to blame." In this early coverage of Nazi Germany, Americans know that Nazis are an anti-Semitic political party in Germany. Anti-Semitism is the hatred and prejudice against Jewish people. And Dorothy Thompson, a journalist, interviewed Hitler for Cosmo in 1932, and she wrote that anti-Semitism is the life and soul of Hitler's movement. The Nazis lose no opportunity to insult the Jews. So in 1933, Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. And from here on, we refer to Germany as Nazi Germany. It is the country controlled by the political party, the National Socialists, or the Nazis. And almost immediately after Hitler, who's the head of the Nazi party, takes control, they begin kicking Jewish people out of the civil service, out of government and education jobs. They sponsor a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany. They burn books from authors who are considered un-German or promoting un-German ideas. And Americans are reading about this. Americans have information that this is happening. In 1936, Nazi Germany hosts the Olympic Games. They host the Winter Olympics and the Summer Games, which were taking place in Berlin. Americans debate whether the United States should participate in the Olympic Games. Should we boycott the Games because we are protesting what the Nazis are doing to Jewish Germans? Or should we go and participate in the Games? Should we not make the Olympics a political thing? And so Americans are really torn about this. Many Americans say we should go. We should show that Nazi ideas are wrong by dominating the Games, by winning medals. And others said, no, we should stay home in solidarity. Caught in the middle are the athletes, particularly black athletes like Jesse Owens. He was a famous sprinter from Ohio State University. And he got a lot of pressure from even his own college telling him to stay behind and to boycott the Olympics, to not go in solidarity with Jews in Germany. He decides to go, and he and 18 other black athletes dominate the games. They win multiple gold medals. Jesse Owens wins 4 gold medals, but the Olympics become a huge propaganda victory for the Nazis, and they do nothing to disrupt racism in the United States. Jesse Owens comes home, and he's still confronted and living in Jim Crow America. If we go around the corner here, we see this next part of this section of the exhibit, which talks about the Kristallnacht attacks. So in November 1938, the Nazis launched a nationwide attack on Jewish citizens in Germany. 30,000 Jewish men are arrested and sent to concentration camps. Hundreds of synagogues are burned. Businesses are destroyed. Houses owned by Jews are ransacked. And this is a huge news story in the United States. You can see here some of the headlines. The San Francisco Chronicle says, "Germans storm Jews, wreck stores, burn synagogues." The LA Examiner says, "The Nazis warn world Jews will be wiped out unless they are evacuated by democracies." The Atlanta Daily World, a black newspaper, says, "German atrocities shock the nation." And so Americans are really stunned by this attack, which they see as a terrorist attack of the German government against its own citizens just because they're Jewish. But we have 2 polls here that show that Americans are kind of split on what to do. So Americans are asked in a Gallup poll in November 1938, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? And 94% of Americans say they disapprove of what the Nazis have done, of these attacks. But then the same people are asked, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? Should we let Jewish people immigrate to the US? And 71% of Americans say no. So Americans have a lot of sympathy for what is happening, but they're not willing to open American doors to Jewish immigrants. We then skip ahead a little bit, and we look at what the United States and what Americans could read about the liberation of concentration camps in 1945. So we've skipped ahead 6 years. World War II has happened, and in the spring of 1945, the American military liberates concentration camps in Germany, finding the remnants of people who have survived the Holocaust and the bodies of the people who didn't. Edward R. Murrow, a famous journalist, records on the radio asking people to believe what they're hearing. Make sure I have only reported part of what I said and heard. For most of it, I have no words. General Dwight Eisenhower, who was the head of the American forces in Germany, asks American soldiers and journalists and congresspeople to come and see these concentration camps that have been liberated and to record what they're seeing, to take photographs, to write letters, to write articles in newspapers, so that the American people will never think that what happened in Germany, what happened during the Holocaust, was just propaganda. If we come over here, we see this little kiosk that shows Nazi Germany in American newspapers. This is part of a project that the Holocaust Museum did beginning in 2016, asking students and teachers and librarians to go into their local newspapers, and we would give an event like the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses and a date to look for. And we asked people to share what they found. So here you can see an article in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner. This is April 1st, 1933. And there's an article here about the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany that I talked about. And so you could be in Fairbanks, Alaska, and you can know that in Germany, the Nazis have sponsored a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. You can go on the museum website to newspapers.ushmm.org and search for your own town newspaper, search for your own city newspaper, and see what was reported in your local area. This section of the exhibition is called, "Did Americans Help Jewish Refugees?" And the answer is really complicated. There were a lot of obstacles to immigration, and a lot of them had been put forward in the 1920s before the Holocaust began, before the Nazis took power in Germany. So Jews who were hoping to flee Germany and Nazi territory, they faced a lot of difficulty. They had to collect a lot of paperwork. You can see here some examples of the different pieces of paperwork that you would need to leave Germany and come to the United States as an immigrant. You needed to apply for immigration. For most countries, there was a waiting list, a very long waiting list where you would have to wait, collect your paperwork, and hope that your interview would come soon and you would be able to come to the United States. You needed a passport, you needed a ship ticket, you needed to talk to the German police and get a certificate of good conduct. Most Jewish refugees also needed a financial sponsor. They needed an American who was going to vouch for them so that they would never become a public charge. That was the word that they used to say that this person, if they are allowed to come to the United States, they will never need any sort of welfare or social support, that they'll be able to support themselves. And so they needed an American who would vouch for them, who would take responsibility for them. And that American needed to send tax documents and insurance statements and letters of recommendation from other people in their community. None of this could be done on the internet. All of this had to be done by going to offices. You can see here this big photo of people lined up outside a police station in Vienna. You had to wait in line. You had to pay often to get copies of these papers. Some of them had expiration dates, and so you had to get one and hope that it was still going to be valid when it was time for your interview. It was very, very difficult to navigate this complicated immigration system. And like I said, a lot of these laws about immigration had been put forward in the 1920s. And one of the laws was called the quota law. And what that meant was that only a certain number of people born in Germany could immigrate to the United States any year. So here you can see that number, 25,957 people by law born in Germany could immigrate to the United States. That doesn't mean, though, that that's the number of people who are coming. You can see here the maximum number allowed by the law, and in gray down here, the number of people who actually come, the number of visas that are actually issued allowing people born in Germany to come to the United States. So legally, the United States could have accepted many more Jewish refugees from Germany than it did. By 1939, when it was clear that Kristallnacht had happened and that life in Germany was unbearable for Jewish people, the US issued the maximum number of visas available by the law. They almost did the same thing in 1940. At the same time, as World War II begins, as Germany invades Poland in September 1939, the US is not involved in the war. And the US is very nervous about what is happening in Europe and about the idea that the United States might get pulled into a war that it doesn't want to get involved in. And so a lot of this tension and a lot of the worries about the war result in new restrictions on immigration. This feeling that if the United States allowed more Jewish refugees, they would influence the US into the war or pull the US into the war. So this man here, Breckinridge Long, was the Assistant Secretary of State, and he said that there's a possibility that Jewish refugees are secretly working for Germany, that the Nazis and other agents are trying to enter the United States pretending to be refugees. And so even though the US already has a limit on the number of people who are coming, they put new rules in place to make that immigration process even more difficult than it already was. There was an effort to try to bring refugee children to the United States in the spring of 1939. This was a bill that was supported by a Democrat in the US Senate and a Republican in the House of Representatives. And you can see that there are a lot of voices in favor of bringing refugee children and opposed to bringing refugee children. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, is in support of bringing refugee children. She says that other countries are taking Jewish refugee children, and the United States should too. Other people are writing into their local newspapers saying, we can't take refugee children because the Great Depression is still going on. We need to help the American child. He deserves our help more than the German child. That was an editorial written by, or a letter to the editor written by an American boy in April 1939. The American people are largely against the idea of bringing refugee children. These would be children between the ages of 5 and 14 who would be placed with foster families in the US. And when Americans are asked, should we take 10,000 refugee children from Germany, 66% of Americans oppose the idea of bringing children to the US. This was a bill that doesn't even make it for a vote in Congress. Here we show some examples of some of the people who are trying to immigrate to the United States and the Americans who are trying to help them. Let's talk about this story. So this girl here is Marianne Winter. She is living in Vienna, Austria with her brother and her parents, and she becomes a pen pal with Jane Bomberger, who lives in Reading, Pennsylvania. 3 years after they become pen pals, largely so that Marianne can practice her English, 3 years after they become pen pals, Marianne writes to Jane and says, my family needs help. They were Jewish, the Nazis had taken over Austria, and Marianne and her family were in danger. And she asks Jane, do you know a rich American who can act as my family's financial sponsor, who can say that we will be responsible for, somebody who will be responsible for us if we're allowed to come to the United States? Now, Jane and her family did not have a lot of money, but they made the decision that they would act as the financial sponsor for Marianne Winter and her family. And so they put together all of the necessary paperwork and they sent it to Europe. And eventually the US State Department agreed and gave Marianne's family immigration visas. And so they were able to arrive in the United States in the beginning of 1939. And they actually lived with the Bomberger family in Reading, Pennsylvania for a little while they were waiting to find their new apartment. So in this case, this family was able to escape because of the pen pal. The little kiosk here shows the actual immigration of ships, ships that are trying to bring Jewish refugees to the United States. And it shows how many people are able to come to the United States. And it shows the story of the MS St. Louis, which was a ship in the spring of 1939, a very complicated story of a group of refugees who are not permitted to enter Cuba and then not welcomed into the United States. This next section of the exhibition looks at the question of war and why the United States got involved in World War II. So World War II began in September 1939. Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and Great Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. The United States did not declare war. The United States was technically neutral in the war. We were not going to get involved. And most Americans were in favor of this. In the spring of 1940, Americans were asked, do you think the United States should declare war on Germany and send our Army and Navy abroad to fight? And if you look, 93% of Americans think the US should not go into war. It's really hard for us to remember right now, but in 1939, the US had been isolationist, had opposed war for about 20 years. And when World War II began, the United States actually had the 17th largest army in the world. We did not have a large military. And so it's not just that Americans don't want to fight, it's that the American military is not ready to fight. Franklin Roosevelt, the president, is in favor of the Allies. He's in favor of Britain and France, and he opposes the Nazis. But he also knows that the American people are not prepared to fight. So he spends the next 2 years trying to figure out ways to prepare the United States for war, because he thinks war is probably going to happen, that the US will be forced to join the war, and to also prepare the country to fight. So he starts and passes a peacetime draft. There's a military draft, even though the United States is not involved in the war. He finds ways to support Great Britain and France through things like lend-lease and cash and carry, these ways of trying to figure out how to provide the Allied countries who are opposing the Nazis with tanks and guns and ships so that they can carry on the war and the Nazis won't win. Americans debate whether we should get involved in the war. There's an organization called the America First Committee, which begins in the fall of 1940. It was founded by college students at Yale University. And within a year, it had over 800,000 Americans joining the America First Committee, which said that we should defend our borders, but we should not get involved in anything that is happening in Europe. It doesn't matter if the Nazis win, we should not get involved. Their most famous speaker was Charles Lindbergh. He was a famous pilot. He was the first pilot to take a solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. And so in early 1940, he was one of the most famous Americans in the world. And he becomes the most prominent speaker for the America First movement. He, in September 1941, gives a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, where he blames the British government, the Roosevelt administration, and Jewish Americans for pushing the United States towards war. He is denounced for being anti-Semitic throughout the country, but I think he is probably voicing the fears and the prejudices of many Americans. He is opposed by a lot of people, but one of the people who opposes him is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss at this time was an editorial cartoonist for a magazine called PM, and he did a lot of different editorial cartoons opposing Charles Lindbergh and opposing the America First movement. This one is one that he did right after Lindbergh made that anti-Semitic speech. And it says that Lindbergh is spreading the lovely Goebbels stuff. Goebbels was a Nazi propaganda minister. And so he says that Lindbergh is shoveling from the Nazi anti-Semite stink wagon, that the things that he is saying is coming straight from the Nazis. And so we should not be listening to people like Charles Lindbergh. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military attacks Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And immediately the United States joins the war. The United States declares war on Japan, Germany declares war on the United States declares war on Germany. And so finally and suddenly, the United States is thrust into World War II. One of the first things that happens after the United States joins the war is that President Roosevelt signs an executive order that ultimately results in more than 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans being imprisoned in what were called at the time concentration camps. I think it's really important to point out that this was the term used by people who supported the camps and people who opposed the imprisonment of Japanese and Japanese Americans. And that this was the same word that they used when talking about camps that the Nazis set up. And I think it's interesting to think about how Americans might have thought the camps in Germany, what they might have thought they were like, if they thought they were just like the camps for Japanese and Japanese Americans. Obviously, this was horrible, and these people lost their rights. And a lot of Americans were in favor of this. More than 90% of Americans believed that it was okay to remove and imprison Japanese Americans who were not citizens and to put them in these camps, and that a lot of this was just based in racism and race. These are all posters that were created largely by the US government that showed Americans what the war was about. They say that the United States went to war because the Nazis are the enemies of Christianity. You see this poster of a dagger with a swastika on the arm stabbing the Bible. This poster of a Nazi boot stamping on a church. That the Nazis are a threat to American children. You see this swastika kind of shadowed over children. These fears that this could happen here, that Nazis could come to America, and that the Nazis are a threat to the American Constitution, to the Bill of Rights, to our freedoms. One thing that the poster doesn't show is this idea that the Nazis are a threat to European Jews. At this point, Americans are not fighting because the Nazis are persecuting Jews or even murdering Jews. Americans are fighting because of ideas of freedom and democracy. They are not fighting and are never really fighting to rescue Jews. The last section of the exhibition looks at how Americans respond to the Holocaust, how Americans learn that Nazis and their allies and collaborators are murdering millions of people, and how Americans respond to that information. So mass murder begins in the summer of 1941. Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union and immediately starts murdering millions of people, about 2 million people in mass shootings, and then they set up killing centers, which murder people in gas chambers. It takes the United States about a year to publicly learn and to publicly admit that this is happening. And it happens in a very roundabout way. The information comes out of Switzerland, it gets to the State Department, and the State Department originally says this is probably just a rumor that the Nazis are murdering millions of people. Maybe we shouldn't call attention to it if it's just a rumor. But the information keeps getting out because the information was true and ultimately gets back to the State Department. By the fall of 1942, the State Department has investigated and they confirm the information. So it is available in newspapers in November 1942 that the Nazis are murdering millions of people, that they have already murdered about 2 million people, and that they are continuing to murder millions more. November 1942 is the same month that the Allied forces land in North Africa. So the American military does not have soldiers on the ground in Europe yet. And so it feels very far away what the Nazis are doing. So the US, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and other groups issue a statement. They say that the United States and these groups oppose the cold-blooded extermination of Jews, and they promise that they will hold war crimes trials after the war. There's no effort at this point to promise any kind of rescue effort to save the lives of Jews. For the next year, for all of 1943, as the US continues to fight both in the Pacific and in Europe, moving through North Africa and invading Italy, there's more information coming out about the mass murder of Jews, and there's more protest as Americans learn more. There is a pageant that is staged and tours the lower 48 states. It tours Madison Square Garden, it is in Washington, D.C., it's in Boston, it's at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, and it is called We Will Never Die, a mass memorial dedicated to the 2 million Jewish dead in Europe. And this pageant argues that the United States is not doing enough, that we need to be doing more. In January 1944, the US finally does decide to do more. The Treasury Department found out that the State Department had been suppressing information about the Holocaust. They'd been keeping information about the murder of Jews from the American people. And so this group at the State Department say, this is not what America should be. We should be trying to rescue Jews, even as we try to win the war. And so they argue to President Franklin Roosevelt that that's what we need to be doing. That's what your administration needs to do now. We need a new policy, and it needs to be a policy of rescue. And Roosevelt eventually agrees, and he creates an organization called the War Refugee Board. This was a government agency tasked with carrying out a US policy of trying to rescue Jews. One of the things that the War Refugee Board did is it opened a refugee camp in upstate New York in the small town of Oswego on the shores of Lake Ontario. And it brought about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees to live there. These were people who were from all over Europe who had made it to Italy at some point during the war. Some had just been liberated from Rome, some had been in hiding, and they all come and they live at this camp in upstate New York for more than a year. You can see that the camp is surrounded by a fence, and the fence is topped with barbed wire. So even when the United States brings really its first group of refugees outside of the immigration system during the war, they put them in a camp and they surround the camp with a fence. The end of the exhibition looks again at liberation. American soldiers are shocked by what they've seen, As we discussed, General Eisenhower brought congressmen and reporters, encouraged soldiers to come and to see, so that this could never be accused of being propaganda, so that Americans would always know that the Holocaust had actually happened. This is the way that we end the exhibition, and we want Americans and our visitors to think about all of the different motives and pressures and fears that impacted the way that Americans in the 1930s and 1940s responded to the Holocaust as it was happening. The United States at the end of the war was no longer an isolationist nation. It was an emerging superpower. It had more than 1/10 of all Americans served in uniform during the war. But we also know that at the end of the war, Americans are polled again, and only 5% of Americans think we should have accepted more refugees or want to accept more refugees now than they had prior to the war. And so, response to the Holocaust as it was happening was difficult. There were a lot of fears and challenges that Americans were facing. But we also want visitors to the exhibition to think about what they would have done or what they could have done and what maybe we should do now as the world is confronted with refugee crises and with atrocities. You know, what can we learn from this history? There's lots of different resources that you can use to learn more, including the museum's Holocaust Encyclopedia. We also have a web version, a larger web version of this exhibition. So I hope some of you are able to come to Seward and see the exhibition in person, but for those of you who can't, I hope this video has been helpful and that you'll continue to learn more about the Holocaust and about American response to the Holocaust. Thanks.